Okay, while I wait for them, let me introduce myself. My name is Kailash Patidar. Some of you might know already. I'm a Deputy Dean of Postgraduate Studies in the Faculty of Natural Sciences, and I will be the Program Director for today. Okay, I request you all to please stand up for the procession to enter. Thank you very much. My request, Kelly Williams, to please sing the national anthem. Thank you. You all may please be seated. May I invite Professor David Holgate, the Dean of the Faculty of Natural Sciences, to welcome the DVC and the audience.
Thanks, Prof. Patida. Thanks, Kailash. Yes, as he said, my job is to say welcome. So let me say welcome. I'm one of those people for whom the statement, all protocols observed, was designed. I like to welcome us all as equals. So from the students, friends, colleagues, it's lovely to have everybody here. But I must particularly acknowledge AJ, who's come to give his inaugural lecture, and of course, Prof. Matete Madiba for representing the executive and being with us this evening. So welcome. It's a faculty celebration. So from my part as Dean, it's great that we can be here to celebrate together. I always say at these events, we wear our gowns, and it's not to be pompous, it's to acknowledge the gravitas of the occasion. That in certain sense, to become a professor is the pinnacle of your academic career, and it's something that we acknowledge and we celebrate. But it's not because we want to be pompous, not because we want to show off. It's because we just want to give it the recognition that it deserves. So I'll let other people do the introductions as we go along, but from my side, a very warm welcome to the faculty, and enjoy the evening together, and enjoy celebrating, in this case, what Prof. Smit has achieved and what he shares with us, and know that we are celebrating together because he is a representative of our faculty. So thank you for being here, and thank you, Kailash.
Thank you, Prof. Algate. Now may I invite our Deputy Vice Chancellor, SDS, to come and say a few words.
I suspect that is to confirm my fear of podiums, that I disappear behind them. Good evening, Thobela, to all of our esteemed guests, colleagues, family, students, and everyone in the audience. Thank you so much for gracing all of us with your presence to be part of this occasion. But I'm very suspicious that you are actually going to thank yourself. You're going to pat yourself on the back for being in this room or in this hall tonight. Because if you have ever wondered, like me, what is happening actually below the blue waters that are sometimes turquoise, I would want to say to you, you are at the right place at the right time. You are going to hear, excuse me, about the hard work, the labor of love over a number of years. But you're just going to be given a glimpse of what has been happening. And you're going to hear about this natural laboratory that Prof. Smit has been working on for a number of years. It is my great pleasure and honor to extend the warm welcome that the Dean has already expressed. Your presence in this inaugural lecture is highly appreciated. On Monday, at the unveiling of the Brian O'Connell Life Sciences Building, we were reminded of the visionary leadership that has shaped this building and more this university, and how the actual building and its symbolism and inspiration has done great wonders that has taken us to this place. It has done wonders, especially to those who sit and work in the building, like Prof. Smit. Because as Prof. O'Connell describes it, putting in this building into the university, and the work that followed was building a picture of a phoenix rising from its ashes. Because since then, UWC has never been the same. It has really regenerated and recreated itself as a university, and has given itself this profile of a local and international research powerhouse. So we are so thankful that tonight we are going to be hearing from one of the people who've enjoyed the inspiration from the building. In my language, we say, Oleho, leli juang pije. Anyone to translate? There's a prize. I'm disappointed. I'll keep my prize. But that means you are definitely that wooden spoon that has been in the pot when things were cooking. So you've been in this space. And the Dean on Monday said, it is the kind of space that even sends some positive peer pressure across the coast. And I am so convinced that you carry the evidence of that inspiration that has gone to work in a space like this. We are really privileged to be your audience tonight. And those of you who are going to be so awake and so focused, you're not going to be disappointed. Because for the university, this is really a celebration of the labor of love, the hard work that goes into research. And in this way, the university continues to be that strong symbol and entity that we are talking about hope. We are talking about action. We are talking about knowledge. And as we do that, UWC continues to make that contribution. And it is because of this type of hard work. So we are here to hear all about it. Please don't cut off anything. We want to hear it all. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Prof. Now I would like to invite Prof. Anusha Rajkaran to come and introduce the inaugural lecture.
Good evening to the academic community. It is my honor to introduce Professor A.J. Smith. Professor Smith began his studies in zoology and botany at the University of Port Elizabeth before specializing in marine botany. He earned his PhD at the University of Cape Town, researching the ecophysiology of Gracilaria gracilis, a red algae, in Saldanha Bay. His career took him abroad to Portugal for a postdoc and Australia, where he worked both as a researcher and environmental scientist, before returning to South Africa to hold positions at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, the eThekwini municipality, and since 2014, the University of the Western Cape. His research has consistently focused on understanding the ecophysiology and ecological roles of seaweed, and more recently, how climate change and extreme events have shaped marine ecosystems. He has led and contributed to numerous international collaborations, from the Exhibits program on extreme events in the Benguela Current to the EU's iAtlantic project on deep sea ecosystems and partnerships with Norway on kelp forests. Alongside this, he co-developed the widely used heat wave R package, which has become a global standard for understanding heat waves. Professor Smith has built a legacy through mentorship. He has supervised more than 27 honors students, 20 masters and 10 PhDs, and has published more than 70 publications in his CV and even more outputs on Google Scholar. AJ has developed innovative courses in ecology and quantitative methods and continues to inspire the next generation of marine scientists, which we can see very clearly by all the students in the venue today. Those who know him personally will also recognize his creative side, a love for photography, his insights and innovation shared on his website, The Tangle Bank, which combines his drive for innovation in learning and teaching and research, and his willingness to teach one and all. These pursuits mirror the qualities he brings to science: energy, patience, and a deep appreciation for life's interconnectedness. For any ecologist, the field stories are what sets us apart or unifies us on the journey to being mad scientists or pirates, depending on your field location. AJ's collaborators and students identify his love for neo-green milkshakes, and students identify his choice of music, which has intense electronic vibes from groups like Acid Arab. His field persona is often described as quirky, eclectic, and erudite, and his colleagues note that he also has an affinity for weird things and mentioned a story involving sampling diatoms along the West Coast, after which a bottle of tequila, brine salt, and a slice of bokkums was further sampled. From his early academic days, students have noted his love for Apple gadgets. Back to 2009, While collecting seaweeds on a rocky shore, students were using heavy equipment and buckets to carry water, while AJ took out his iPhone and started measuring some aspect of the shoreline. Since then, AJ has always been the gadget and tech person, always using his phone or some app to record fieldwork activities, and his love for Apple products is almost evangelical. AJ is an inspiring person in the classroom, lab, and field. Currently is helping to self-drive AI integration, not just in BCB, but the faculty, and as always, is getting things sorted, or as AJ says, sorted. There we go. Colleagues, it is my privilege to welcome Professor Albertus Johannes Smit as he delivers his inaugural lecture entitled Between Two Oceans, Currents, Climate, and the Future of South Africa's Coasts.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, DVCs, Deans, Deputy Deans, HODs, everyone else, all the colleagues, all the students. It's amazing to see such a full venue. It's fuller than my classes tend to be, even. So welcome. I did prepare a presentation, but apparently it's not here. I sent it out yesterday, but it's not available. So I'll just talk. So yeah, I was quite reluctant to apply for promotion, but here I am. I think, you know, I should have applied many years ago, but as is typical of me, I'm not particularly good or enthused by record keeping or doing admin, so I neglected for many years to accumulate all the module evaluation forms. So even though I could have applied for promotion many years ago based on my research, it's only because of COVID recently that I decided to make a concerted effort to accumulate all of my teaching efforts, reviews from external examiners, from students, and all these various people responsible for ensuring that the consistency and the quality of modules are maintained. That I eventually felt secure enough to submit my application for promotion a couple of years ago. So here I am. My next slide shows my next slide shows a list of all the students. And sorry, I'm typically not used to standing still when I talk. In my lectures, all the students can attest I'd be walking up and down the sides of the aisles. But this slide shows that it's only because of the hard work and the dedication and the presence in my life of a whole host of students, many of whom I see sitting here. There's ex-PhD students and all the current masters and PhD people. Many of them are here, many of them are overseas at the moment, but it's great to see everyone here. And it's only because of all of their hard work that I'm able to make this presentation here this evening. Also, it's as a result of collaborations with people that are far brighter than me. Some of my closest colleagues internationally, Thomas Wernberg and David Skuman and so on. It's because of discussions with those people that I have been able to have all of these ideas that I've had over all of these years. You're welcome to come, yeah. This also feels a little bit like me doing my second and third year lectures where CPET usually comes along and helps me set up everything because these computers don't work with my Apple devices.
Nicely done, Prof.
But I have been assured by the knowledgeable IT staff over here that's because of the propensity for the university to take the cheapest of 10 quotations when they buy the electronic kit that's supposed to talk to our computers. So it's not really my fault. So let's just give it a moment. I actually do have some slides. Yeah, but let me continue talking anyway. Let me go around the other side.
I'll be in now, Prof. I'm just copying it over.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Lovely. So this was my first slide. This is the second slide. These are all the people that have been heavily implicated in the work that I've done. And the list is by no means extensive and exhaustive. There are other people as well, but the reason I'm including these individuals is because their story contributes towards the story that I'd like to tell you today. But, you know, it all started for me many, many years ago when I was much younger. You can even see there when I was like 2 years old or so, there's a kelp behind me. I didn't look at kelp then, but it was in my life since a very young age. But I think the most influential thing in my life, and it's the reason why I carry on at students all of the time about the importance to read, is that books have been central in my life. And it's because of a household filled with books about nature that I presume that's one of the reasons that I took the journey that I did take. Books are so, so, so important, and one of the saddest things that I can see today is that people are so unwilling to engage with more information that can fit onto a mobile phone screen. So it is because of this reason that I developed the website that Anusha spoke about, and I've taken all of my pre-recorded lectures and I've put them into a long-form multi-100-page textbook format that students can use, but because of AI, they take that entire textbook, they put it into Notebook LM, and they reduce it right back to PowerPoint slides. So, yeah, it doesn't work. Students don't read, and it's sad because there's a wealth of information, many, many, many people's lived experiences caught up in books that we really, I think, as it's our duty as people with an interest in the natural world to read. But my academic career really started after my PhD. It was during this period. This is before I obviously came to UWC. These photographs represent a time in my life when I had hair, firstly. But I spent a lot of time on beaches and by estuaries and mangroves and so on, sampling with the students at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, and I worked on various different places around South Africa. Initially, as Anusha also indicated, I started working on aquaculture. I think I was one of the first people, if not the first person in South Africa to do aquaculture, seaweed aquaculture related research, firstly in tanks on the coast of Quebec, and then later on in Saldanha Bay. Spent many, many days and hours and weeks diving in Saldanha Bay, which was quite unpleasant. And then I went to Australia and Portugal, and I continued to be immersed in seagrasses and seaweed cultivation some more. But it is because of my time in Australia, really, where I engaged with people who, for the first time since leaving South Africa, had bigger ideas than I ever thought were possible. And it's because of people with ideas that it inspired me to really be very adventurous in the work that I do. So initially I started working on seagrasses, seaweeds first, later on seagrasses. But a world of, stable isotope ratio mass spectrometers, the picture that you can see there on the bottom. Sorry, I was meant to put on a recording device. Apparently, let me just quickly do this. I should ask Linda how this works. She showed me before. Oh, it doesn't work. Sorry, excuse me. It's not an Apple device. It's okay, there it goes. Right, and I also have a laser pointer, which is what Patrick lent me. So this can also be switched on. So stable isotope. Sorry, I'm walking away again. Stable isotope ratio mass spectrometers. This is where I, for the first 5 or 6 years of my life, I really spent, not of my life, of You know, I did have chemistry sets and microscopes when I was young, but after a post-PhD student, I spent many hours in a lab like that, many hours on beaches, in estuaries, looking at rocky shores. And there's me a little bit later on with a little bit less hair. That's after I started my real academic journey. It has an effect on hair. I mean, in Adriaan's case, it went gray. And later on, I rekindled my love for marine chemistry, and this is the lab that I used to have at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, where I spend many days and weekends and so on analyzing samples and understanding the chemical methods that go into understanding how seawater chemistry works. And there's a couple of experiments that you can see on the bottom, on your right-hand side, that shows some of the experiments I have done on ships, which is something that I really detest doing. I don't like going onto ships like Professor Gibbons does, and in laboratories, which is where I'm far more comfortable, as well as in other settings like on beaches and on rocky shores and underwater and so on. But I left all of this behind when I came to UWC. And this is the work that I really want to talk about today. It's the work that I have done since 2014, when I was appointed here as an associate professor or something. And my interest didn't necessarily shift to kelp. I've always been interested in kelp because I've had many days and weeks diving in kelp forests. But the climate change interest, the climate change angle became a lot more central in what it is that I did. And I think one of the reasons that I started to look at climate change is because it was a pragmatic decision. It was easy to do because suddenly, you know, unlike having a multi-million rand laboratory where you need to analyze chemical samples and spend many days and so on in a laboratory coat, and it costs a huge amount of money to run a lab like that. For the first time, I could have access to a lot of free information that, as a result of the good people at NOAA, at NASA, at the European Space Agency, and so on, made available for us at no cost, as long as you're associated with an academic institution. So this became my laboratory, the region around South Africa, those two currents that form the eastern side and the western side of South Africa. Those two currents are called the Agulhas Current and the Benguela Current. The one is very cold, full of nutrients, and the other one is very warm, and one of the most rapidly flowing currents in the world. And between those two currents, there's a whole host of studies that we can do. There's a whole host of research questions, so many ideas and opportunities for anyone who has an inquiring mind. And fortunately or unfortunately, my mind is such that I can at one moment think about seaweeds in a laboratory flask, and at the next moment I can stand thousands of kilometers back and look at the ocean like that. And for me, the most entertaining and the most insightful thing to do is to connect all of these various different dots. And to draw the links between what happens at the very broad scale to what happens at the very local scale. So that's what I've been doing since I came to UWC, and this is what I'm going to be talking about. So those currents are very important for various reasons. They set up not only interesting conditions in the ocean itself, which is where I do most of my work, but it also influences especially the Agulhas Current, which is a current that has a huge amount of heat in it. It sets the experience that you have when you travel to KwaZulu-Natal. The reason the ocean is warm there is because of the Agulhas Current, but the reason it's hot and humid and there's a lot of rain and a lot of estuaries, a lot of mosquitoes, high humidity, all of that has to do with the Agulhas Current. And on the western side of the country, it's much colder and arid. And that's also as a result of, firstly, the absence of the Agulhas Current, but secondly, the presence of the Benguela Current, which is very much opposite in terms of what the Agulhas does. Opposite in every aspect that you can almost think about. On the eastern side of the country, there's a huge amount of biodiversity. There's a low productivity, but on the western side, there's a low biodiversity, but a huge amount of productivity. Productivity meaning all of the biological processes leading up to the huge amount of fish that people extract from the ocean at that part of the world. And the consequences go all the way from temperature to rainfall to climate, all the way down to socioeconomic, socio-ecological influences and the lives and livelihoods of people who live by the coast, especially here in the Western Cape, where people have a far longer history of being connected to the coast. And I'll mention that briefly a little bit later on. So let's look at both of these currents, and I'll start with the first set of currents, the ones that run on the eastern side of South Africa. So that's the Agulhas Current. So they are called western boundary currents because they bound the western side of the big ocean basins. Those currents we share with, we share western boundary currents here in South Africa with also similar currents with a similar dynamic, similar physical oceanography with places like off the coast of Japan, the Kuroshio Current, the East Australian Current, and then there's the Brazil Current and the Gulf Stream. You can see the currents here very clearly. They are the, wrong one. So they are these very brightly colored patches of water running down the coast, and you can see them on the eastern side of most of the continents there. So those are the western boundary currents. And in the case of the Agulhas Current, it is quite beautiful to look at. I mean, I really would have liked to show you an animation. These figures that you see here, they were created by the NOAA Jet Propulsion Laboratory in the United States. And it's an animation of the global ocean, of the entire planet. It rotates, and you can see where all the eddies and so on come from. Those little round blobs that you see there, those things, they're called ocean eddies. It's like, you know, when you take a cup of black coffee and you drop a drop of milk in there, those little whirls that you see there, those are eddies as well, but these are on a much larger scale. Those would be about maybe 200 to 300 kilometers across or so. And they are very much instrumental in the experience that we have in the ocean here in South Africa, but also they have similar consequences for the world regions elsewhere in the world. All the western boundary currents have a similar kind of consequence for the world. So it's quite interesting to study. The next thing that happened that was important, that had a major influence on how I ask questions, was, I'm going to move along to the next thing, is a paper that I wrote with Neville Swade some while ago. Actually, that happened after the event that I want to talk about just now, is that we find ourselves in Africa, in all of the world, in fact, but I'm only zooming down into Africa now, in a place where, at the same time, we have oceans that are warming up. So if you see here, that is the warming up of the Agulhas Current itself, but you can see there at some places there's little blue spots, which is where the ocean current, the oceans are actually cooling down. So that became a major thing that we've started to study over the years. It's the heterogeneity in the warming up and the cooling down of the oceans along the coast, and trying to figure out what the consequences are of these warming up and cooling down patches in the ocean. One of the first papers that were published that sort of, not quite directly, but indirectly linked the consequence of the cooling down of the ocean was a paper we wrote in, I think, 2012 or so, that looked at the eastward shift in the distribution of kelp along the coast of South Africa. And that is, now we know that it is directly associated with the cooling down of the ocean in that part of the world. So where kelp elsewhere on the planet tend to be affected by the warming up of oceans, in South Africa, kelp are affected by the persistence of cool patches that are called refugia, where they can continue to thrive and indeed continue to increase and enhance their productivity over the years. So these became the things that I started to look at. And one of the tools that became available, I'm going to get a little bit nerdy now because I am going to show a couple of slightly complicated slides, but I'll try to speak English as I explain them. The first thing that we did was that, so for those of you who are not scientists, don't worry, it's just a figure to indicate that it's complicated. But the idea is that whereas up until that point in time, around about 2016 or so, most of the world looked at the world as changing in terms of its mean temperature. The average temperature changed over time. But for the first time that year, in 2016, a group of people led by Alistair Hobday in Australia and Thomas Wernberg and so on, wrote a paper about marine heat waves, and since then marine heat waves have been in the news repeatedly, very often. And then my PhD student at the time and I decided to take the existing Python package, which oceanographers used, and we wrote it in a different programming language called R, and made it available here on this CRAN website. It's available on GitHub, and it's been downloaded since 2017 about 51,000 times, and it's been cited by 360 publications and so on. So it's been a continuously utilized way of analyzing the temperature distribution in the ocean. And what this package does is it looks at the extremes of the temperature variability in the ocean. So it looks at periods in time in the ocean in a time series of seawater temperatures where the sea surface temperature exceeds a threshold of 90%, or the 90th percentile of all of the temperatures recorded at a particular place, at a particular time, and persists at that level for 5 or 6 or 7 or more days. So those are what's called marine heat waves. So this became the ability to analyze ocean temperatures now in terms of the marine heat waves became the thing that we use, the tool that we use, the metric that we use to try and understand how the ocean is changing. And one of my initial analyses was this one. It's again another complicated slide. This one is very complicated. It was even complicated to me because it took me about 7 years or so to solve it finally. But what it shows are a couple of different things. Again, it's a view taken of the ocean, not in terms of the change in the average temperature over time, but what we see there on the top left-hand side, figure A, is just basically where the Agulhas Current is. Figure B, that orange and yellow and red region that's encircled in a black polygon, that is the region where the eddies, that little blobs of milk twirls that's at ocean scale, tend to happen. And on the bottom left-hand side in C, those are the individual paths, the trajectories that each of these eddies can take over their lifetime. And on the bottom right-hand side, that is one of the metrics that we can calculate using the marine heat wave algorithm. And when I just did this out of curiosity because, I had a new algorithm to play with, and that's what I did. I had the ocean's worth of data available, and in fact, I did this entire analysis on the entire world's ocean, but I'm showing here now the Agulhas Current. And you can see there, the two interesting things is that, Patrick, your thing is very complicated, are those two figures. That's the area where the eddies are mostly active, so that's where all of the energy in the ocean sits in that part of the world. A lot of movement happens there, a lot of swirls and twirls and patches of water spinning off the main current and moving elsewhere in the ocean. But if you locate the spatial location of this, where the eddies are with where the heat waves are, you'll see that the heat waves are a little bit further south. But they always seem to be associated not only in South Africa, but elsewhere in the world as well. If you look at the other currents, again, it's complicated, but the important thing is the figures on the right-hand side. So the gray area over there is where the eddies and so on are active, and always in the vicinity of where the eddies are active, you have that purple patch, which is where the marine heat waves unfold. So there seems to be a close association between where heat waves happen in the ocean and where most of the ocean's energy is concentrated and focused. So that became a thing that took me down a rabbit hole that lasted about 7 years. And the reason it took me this long is because I'm not an oceanographer, but I like to play with these kinds of data, and these are the types of questions that oceanographers typically try to answer. But because I'm a biologist, I have a different set of tools. I have statistics, where oceanographers tend to find examples of 3 or 4 or 5 cases where their hypothesis turns out, individual events. What I try to do is I like to use a statistical tool to look at the generality of the case, whether the hypothesis not only holds true for 5 or 6 times, for 5 or 6 events, but that in general it holds true as it's not a law, but it's a property of the ocean. It's the association between where heat waves are and where most of the ocean's energy is. And that this statistically holds true across all of the western boundary currents around the world. Here's the statistical evidence. It is, again, a very complicated thing, and that's the reason that it took me so long. I won't explain here, but it's for those of you who've been in my quantitative ecology classes, is similar in that kind of ballpark, just working on time series now. You can see there that the important thing to note here are the blue and the pink lines, which always seem to follow each other very, very strongly. There's a very strong correlation between those time series, a time series of the energy in the ocean and a time series of the heat in the ocean. And that's true across all of the various different boundary currents. And the only reason that I managed to finally produce this final output is because of AI earlier this year, where something that I just couldn't figure out, some mathematical implication of or application of a tool called a Varimax rotation. I managed to use AI to use it, and it sort of removed the anticipation. It became a little bit dull at the end of it, because it sort of removed the novelty of the whole solution. So I'm a little bit disappointed with how it turned out, and I'm also disappointed because what it shows is actually quite obvious. But I think the reason I'm showing this is because it talks to my general approach in doing science, which is to say that the obstacle is the way. I have a habit of finding the most complicated way to solve the most simple problem. I see Dave is nodding at the top there. And if Tom was here as well now, and Amiro, they would also be nodding, because that's really what I do. But for me, this is the last thing that I think about at night when I go to sleep is how to solve these kinds of questions, because I'm a human, and what humans do is we work with knowledge and we work with information, and we can decide the difficulty of the challenges that we want to accept into our lives. So that's why I do what I do, and that's why I like to take dynamical processes that happen over vast ocean regions and try to figure out what the consequences are for local scale experiences, not only amongst people, but the ecosystems and the organisms that reside there. So one of the examples that we can talk about now is a consequence of what we saw in the previous slides, the extreme amount of heat in the ocean. One of the things that has happened over the last couple of years, it happened just shortly after COVID, was when the most extensive event happened in South Africa, and there were widespread reports of fish dying off all over the place, from the Eastern Cape right down to Cape Town. And even things like, manta rays, the reef manta over there, and sea snakes, which are typically associated with more subtropical regions, they started washing up in places where they don't belong, which is typically outside of their distributional range. It was a large number of these incidents that happened. And this is what drew our attention to the more coastal manifestations of these extreme heat events. And in this instance, the extreme heat that I'm talking about sits on the opposite side of the heat distribution. That's extreme cold events called cold spells. And when cold spells happen, it's a sudden influx of water from deeper down in the ocean, and it appears near the surface at the coastal environment. And because the fish is then trapped between the approaching cold water and the coast where they cannot escape from, they are stunned and eventually they wash up on the shore. So this is what's happening there. And so we started to investigate this kind of phenomenon. And one of my master students, Jesse, here this evening. He's not here. He's working on this. And another master student, Shanae Klaassen, is also working on this. She's currently in Grahamstown at Rhodes University, where she's analyzing tagged fish data using the acoustic telemetry platform that's maintained and operated by SAION and by SIAB. So she is looking specifically at the consequences, the ecological consequences of how fish are being affected and how their movement patterns are being affected, their behavior is being affected by the approaching cold water and so on. So that's what she is doing. And we have found some evidence, which is evidence to show that the coast south of South Africa has changed very, very starkly and significantly in more or less 2007. What I'm pointing at now is a comparison between that little box called SE, which is off the edge of the coast of South Africa, off the edge of the continental shelf, and that very coastal box called C1. So I'm going to compare the extreme temperature conditions between the very coastal box and the not the very offshore, but the offshore shelf edge box. So only those two things is what I'm going to compare now, because something very interesting happened there. And this is what happened. So don't, again, just look at the only thing that I want you to pay attention to. Don't worry about the y-axis or x-axis or all of those things. Just compare the general set of left-hand panels and the general set of right-hand panels. The only thing that, even if you're far away and you sort of squint your eyes, what you'll see is that there's more blue and red on the right-hand side, and there's less blue and red on the left-hand side. All of the panels on the right-hand side, those happened since 2007. All the ones on the left-hand side happened prior to 2007. So it's showing that something happened in the ocean more or less that time that caused a rapid increase in the difference in temperature across the shelf, with the inshore environment becoming much, much, much cooler, and which has resulted in those fish kills that have become more apparent over the last while, and the offshore box that I showed you, which is where it's generally becoming warmer. So there's been an enhanced gradient in extreme temperatures across the Agulhas Bank, which all happened more or less around 2007. And if we can find sufficient ecological evidence for this, it would be evidence for a thing that we call a regime shift. It's a phase transition between very different phases in the ocean. So this is the topic of Jesse's master's. I'm a little bit annoyed at Jesse because he, last year, someone published a paper in Nature on exactly this. And he had been sitting on this now for a few years before then. So, yeah. But this is what we do, and it's fine. There are still various different other angles that we can take. And so this work is continuing into the future. So this is what Shanae is working on. She has these the array of little white dots on the map. There are the acoustic monitoring stations, and then those eagle rays are tagged with devices that transmit a signal whenever it comes into proximity to one of those listening stations. So by looking at how these fish are moving along the coast and looking at a simultaneous time series in temperatures, specifically the cooler events, she is trying to figure out the consequence of marine cold spells on the behavioral ecology of some of these fish. And this is work that's happening together with some colleagues at Rhodes University, Warren Potts and Amber Robin-Childs. So this is a nice example to show how we can go from that very bird's eye satellite view of ocean processes. These are views taken of the ocean literally off satellites that orbit 800, 900 kilometers above Earth's surface to this very local scale over a distance of about 25 kilometers. And I think by being able to couple those different spatial scalings in physical versus biological processes, there's so much that we can learn about the nature of the ocean around us. And now we need to move to the other set of currents. Again, these are currents that we share in common with the western side of North Africa, the Canary Current, the California Current off the western side of North America, and the Humboldt Current off the western side of South America. They are eastern boundary currents, or more commonly known as upwelling systems. And these upwelling systems are unique around the world for its very high levels of nutrients. Now, nutrients are what's necessary for phytoplankton, for those plants in the ocean to grow, to be very productive. Even though there's a low diversity, in other words, not too many different types of algae or other organisms, zooplankton and fish in the ocean, there's a huge amount of it. And this is very important for our national economy because it supports a huge big fishery. Used to be a lot bigger in the past. But the world has changed around us, and the Benguela Current is no longer as productive as it used to be, or maybe the productivity in terms of phytoplankton is as productive as it used to be. But the fisheries resources have changed over the years. So that is the other set of currents that we're looking at. And in South Africa, of course, we're very lucky to have here in Cape Town a place almost where those two oceans meet. Not quite. I mean, the Two Oceans Aquarium is not quite correctly named because the oceans do meet between Cape Town, between the Cape Peninsula and more or less Cape Agulhas, not only at the aquarium. But, you know, the idea holds. The principle is that two oceans do meet over a relatively small geographical region, and it's got very interesting consequences for us who find the ocean very interesting. So we have different questions around climate change that we can ask about the Benguela Current. So as I said, these eastern boundary currents are very important in terms of the productivity because even though the eastern boundary upwelling systems cover less than 1% of the entire ocean's surface, it is nevertheless responsible for about 20% or so of the global ocean fisheries. So they are very significant areas around the world where people spend a huge amount of time and energy and effort to try and understand what the consequences is of the changing climate and the consequences for fisheries and how people can make a living off those resources. And so this is where a whole host of other students have come into play, and the next few slides are going to be about their findings and their analyses and so on. But it relates to the coupling between an understanding of how the ocean works, how upwelling works as a process, and then on the left-hand side, your left-hand side picture there, it's kelp forest. So that's really my major interest, and it takes me right back to my early days as a phycologist. A phycologist is someone who studies algae. So I am a phycologist, and this slide shows the connectivity, the coupling between those processes that happen at a very broad scale along the countries of South Africa, Namibia, and Angola, and the consequences for the kelp forest that we have along that part of the world. So, yeah, that's what I'm going to talk about next. And that coupling between kelp forest and the upwelling process, or the upwelling process itself, has all of those various different consequences. That's why it matters to people, because people make a living from it. The fisheries in Angola has entirely collapsed, and the people there are being very negatively affected as a consequence. In South Africa and Namibia, we're still not as unlucky, and it seems that we won't be as unlucky as the Angolans were. Very different processes operating there at the very northern edge of the Benguela upwelling system. But it also supports commercial fisheries, aquaculture. Aquaculture is a thing that I will not talk about because for various reasons, but it's something that I seriously frown upon nowadays. Sorry, Gavin. No, it's just, yeah, I'll rant about aquaculture later on. And then there's mining industries, which I can equally rant about, and shipping and tourism and all of these various different things happen there. And changes in the ecosystem are going to have consequences for all of those various different sectors of our economy. But we've been looking specifically at, I think, subsistence fisheries. We've looked at shipping. My colleague Neville Swade has looked at the changing wind patterns in the Agulhas, in the Benguela system, and consequences for the operation of the Port of Cape Town, and so on. So we don't really deal much with commercial fisheries. We're more interested in what people experience in those systems because they are more directly affected. They have less buffering in terms of their economic ability to weather the extremes in the environment that's happening there. But this is again that paper that I showed before, and it shows again that we are fortunate in southern Africa, looking at the picture on the right-hand side now, where at least in terms of the extremes or the rapidity of change in the mean temperature around Africa, we are reasonably fortunate because much of the west coast is in a region, especially in South Africa and Namibia, not Angola, in a region where temperatures are not responding very fast, and there's a huge amount of heterogeneity such that the inshore temperatures are actually cooling down, although it's warming up a little bit offshore. In the Agulhas Current itself, it's warming up, but then there are patches inshore around about Mossel Bay, and nowadays I see even at Port Elizabeth in Quebec, it's cooling down a little bit, especially during summer months, but not so much during winter. So we are fortunate that as far as the amount of change that's possible due to climate change, anthropogenic climate change, we are not experiencing it as severely as those neighbors of ours in the Mediterranean and in the Red Sea and so on. So that's where it's really, really severe. It's almost obvious why it's happening so badly there. But we do benefit from a very open ocean where it's slightly moderated by offshore processes, and the water is not as much trapped within a enclosed basin of between the northern and the southern hemisphere, or between Europe and Africa. In terms of productivity is very difficult to figure out because the data are very difficult. Productivity, again, is how productive the system is in terms of being able to support the fisheries that people extract. And there is evidence to show on the bottom right-hand side that some places are actually being negatively affected by a lowering of productivity, but those are in the more offshore regions and not necessarily in those regions where kelp forests are. Elsewhere along South Africa, it's very difficult to have good data for those kinds of changes. This is again from that paper that Neville and I wrote some time ago. So that's interesting, and I think I'm actually going to skip over this. But the effect, the thing here is that I actually want to show. Again, it's complicated, but don't worry. But the thing that I want to show you is that the Agulhas Current is actually now having an influence. So the Agulhas Current, I just want to go back a few slides. So what I'm talking about are these eddies that spin off the Agulhas Current, those rings. Every now and again, most of them would sort of spin off, and many of them leak into the South Atlantic Ocean, and some of them can actually travel all the way across to the other side where South America is, bringing hot water and all the propagules and salt and so on all the way across the South Atlantic. But every now and again, some of them can, because with the continental shelf is quite narrow there it's quite wide, so there it's about 70 or 80 kilometers or so wide. No, it's more than that, 200 kilometers or so. But there it's quite narrow. So every now and again, some of these patches of hot water can break off and come onto the shore, and this is what that figure is showing, is that especially figures number 1 and 2 on the top side, they show that during summer and spring seasons, we have a condition where under some atmospheric and ocean current configuration, some of those hot water events can come right onto the shore. And when they come onto the shore, they bring warm water sitting close to where the kelp forests are, and sometimes even going onto the kelp forest. And if the wind calms down for a substantial period of time after one of those events has happened, then the kelps don't do very well in terms of their physiology. You can actually see them. They start to die off and they become slimy, and they leak bits of stuff into the water. And that brings us to the work that Dave over there has done, which looked at the consequences for marine food webs in terms of what kelps contribute towards the productivity compared to phytoplankton that lives in that part of the world. And it shows that during many parts of the world, along many parts of South Africa, along that part of the coast, kelp is a significant, up to about, I remember, 80% of the total inshore production can be supported by kelp rather than phytoplankton. So that's a significant finding. And if the water becomes increasingly warm, then more of those particles are going to come into the ocean, and there's going to be a shift towards the filter feeding and suspension feeding food webs away from detrital production and so on. So those are just interesting ecological consequences of these heat waves happening along the shore, and I'll move on from this slide now. This slide is again, I'm sorry, it is complicated again, but this is just to show that another student, this is now talking about Amira Abrams' work for a master's as well. She showed that upwelling is in fact in the southern Benguela, it's increasing, because you can see there on the left-hand side panels, SST on the top, in the southern Benguela, sea surface temperature is decreasing, and that's linked to what she did for the first time, which is something that people haven't really done when it comes to upwelling before, is to count the number of upwelling events that happen. So typically people, when they study upwelling, they look at the cooling down of the sea surface temperature, and that's an indication of upwelling becoming more intense. But what Amira has done for the first time is she's able to count every event and to relate the presence of, or the increasing tendency for these events to become more prevalent over recent years to the decreased sea surface temperature during those times. And it turns out that it's in fact a pattern that holds not only for the southern Benguela, but for 2 or 3 other places around the world as well. So that was quite a nifty paper, and this is something that Tom Spencer Hicken, who's now spending 10 months in Canada on an oceanography course, his masters took this work forward. What Amira hasn't been able to show is that she hasn't been able to show that the sea surface temperature is actually being forced, is being driven by, is being caused by changes in the wind dynamics. That's always been something that internationally people have struggled with because of the quality of the wind data that we have available. But what Tom has now started to do, and again, sorry about this, but there's Occam's professor. It's when faced with 2 possible ways doing something, the more complicated one is the one your professor will most likely ask you to do. So Tom has done a more complicated thing, but it's an amazing set of results. The paper was recently submitted, so we'll see what's going to happen there. But what it shows is that in the Benguela system, the extreme cold temperatures seem to be becoming colder, whereas the warm temperatures seem to be becoming warmer, which is an amazing finding, and it's something that no one has really, up until this analysis, has been able to do. And he has also been able to show that there is a definite relationship between some properties, some metrics of how we can measure wind and how upwelling is responding. And again, we could do this only because we had access to a very high resolution wind data set from Australia. And he shows that the wind stress curl and the longshore wind stress are very important in mediating and modulating those sea surface temperature responses. So that's what's happening there. And then we've got some other studies that I've done that are happening at the moment, and some previous students that I've had that looked at storm surge prediction, sea level change. We've studied with Professor Boardman in Quebec at Sion. And then my colleague Neville Swade is looking at extreme winds in the port of Cape Town. So these things are, of course, quite important. Sea surface or sea level change happens at the rate of about 2.7 millimeters per year around South Africa. There's significant regional variation, but it's not something that we're too worried about. But storm surges are becoming a little bit of a concern, because this is where the tidal level and water levels, as well as winds and waves and swells, start to interact. But it turns out that machine learning is able to give us at least a little bit of an advanced warning, and this is something that we are currently working on again with some Kenyan colleagues to try and extend the South Africa's storm surge warning capacity into Kenya, where people are being affected by that. Again, this is a program that I am involved in. It's run here at UWC, but specifically Neville Swade is very much interested in those kinds of things. So that's what's happening there. So, you know, for these things that are way beyond my immediate interest, I leave it to colleagues who are far better to deal with those questions to run. So I don't mind playing along with them. But within the same program, there's other aspects of extreme temperature and other variability that happens along the coast that I myself play along in. And then there's other types of extreme events that happen along our west coast, and this is not something I myself do, but these are happening as a result of harmful algal blooms and low oxygen events, and this happens very often along our coast. And this is a recent event, I think about a year or so ago, where so many fish started to accumulate in the very near shore. I think these are photographs taken at the Victoria Wharf at the waterfront, where they all came into the ports because that was the only place where there was still sufficient oxygen available for them to breathe, and they could only come up to the water surface to catch the oxygen, and eventually even that would dissipate and they would die off. So these events happen. It's not something that I'm particularly interested in. There are other people far better equipped to deal with these kinds of questions. And in fact, one of them, the person who works on harmful algal blooms, Grant Pitcher, recently received the same prize that Professor Gibbons received a while ago, the Gilchrist Memorial Award, on his work on the harmful algal blooms. So aside from the things that I've just mentioned, I've mentioned that there's a change in the upwelling. That's going to cause many parts of the coast to become increasingly cool. It's going to become more comfortable for many species of animals and plants to live there. Those are called thermal refugia. The cooling down of the ocean also leads to putting more nutrients into the water there, that in some parts is going to result in a higher productivity. The mean temperature is going to go down, and some recent work is Ross here? No, he's not here. That Ross Koppen, PhD student, has done. He has showed that in warmer waters, kelp actually becomes smaller, and in colder waters, they do become larger. And this has been confirmed by a recent paper we have in Scientific Communications that show that this is a trend that's in fact true across all kelps, or many kelps, laminarian kelps, the large ones that we see here. So as the ocean becomes warmer in many parts of the world, their kelps become smaller. And then the marine heat waves are going to cause heat stress, which is going to cause changes in the ecosystem configuration, more energy being lost to the ecosystem via filter feeding and suspension feeding pathways, whereas an intensification of winds and waves and so on is going to cause losses in macroscopic kelps. The large kelps wash off, and that's going to drive ecosystems that are more dependent on large macroscopic exports of kelp. And then, of course, the human experience is also going to be modulated by all of these various different changes. I'm going to quickly move along. So I've already mentioned all of those things. This is an interesting study that another PhD student of mine, Zara Prue, she's not registered at this university, she's at UCT. It was easier for her to register there, and I'm co-supervising her because of the diving facilities. It's far more able to support field operations like this. But this is a project that we have actually been planning for many years. I've been speaking about this research for at least 10 years with my colleague Thomas Wernberg, and only in the last 2 years because of the assistance of many people here in the room, we've been able to pull off. And that involved repeating a study that was last done about 45 years ago by John Field at UCT, they did an extensive survey of kelp forests back then. That was in 1978 to 1981, thereabout. They had huge big teams of divers, and they did an extensive diving survey. So you can imagine how much that takes today with all the various different committees that have something to say about how you're meant to do your research and how not, which has become more of an hindrance. And one of the reasons that's contributed to me not doing too much field work is because of bureaucracy. It just makes things impossible. Often these kinds of regulations around how you're meant to dive are decided by people in Pretoria who's never even seen the ocean before, so it's absolutely ridiculous. So finally we managed to coordinate many different departments, so the DFFE divers, SAION divers, my divers, as well as UCT's divers, and we put a big team of divers together, and they revisited those same sites that were sampled 45 years ago, using exactly the same methodologies that they applied back then, today. And the finding of Zara's study is that over that 45-year period, there's been no change in our kelps, which is an amazing confirmation of something that we have suspected for a very long time, that our kelps are doing really well. But now we have, for the first time, real information, real data to show that they are not changing. This analysis was confirmed also by an analysis of Landsat satellite data, which were prepared by some colleagues at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution in the United States, and an analysis over also about a 40-year period using Landsat data confirmed that during that time there's been very little change, if any change. There has been some interannual or decadal scale variability, but not to the extent that it would ultimately result in the overall reduction in the amount of kelp along our coast. So that was an amazing study. Zara is about a couple of months away from submitting, I suppose. Well, they always say they're a couple of months away. And then there are various different hidden connections. So most of what I've just spoken about is concerned with things that you can actually see, the actual real live kelp and so on. But much of what happens around kelp forests are exported via microscopic little bits called POM, particulate organic matter. That's what Dave worked on up there. And they are exported in various different ways, and that's related to the, not to tidal, but to upwelling cycles and so on. So that's been quite interesting. And then some other studies have looked at the communities of diatoms that are associated with kelp stipes and the fronds and so on. Those are microscopic little tiny algae that live attached to the stipes, the stems and the leaves, the fronds of kelp plants. So those have been, that's one of the first studies that's ever looked at the microflora associated with kelp and so on. This was done by a student, Serge Mayambo, who's currently in Germany. And then Zoe over there, who's sitting at the back, I see her there. She has normal colored hair today, usually it's blue. She is looking at the extent to which kelp is able to support the diversity and the productivity of fish. It seems obvious that kelps would do this, but when you actually look at the data, it's not so clear that they actually do that. So that's what Zoe is looking at. And then Ross Coppen, who's also not here, ex-PhD student, he built numerical models that involved kelp, and he looked at when you parameterize an ocean model with kelp and so on, where do the kelp go to once they are lost from the coast? And he ran various different models, and it shows that kelps there are definitely some spots. Those are your left-hand side, kelp, where the purplish, reddish kinds of colorations are. That's where kelps are going to on the surface, and on the bottom, you can see there some of the red and the yellowish patches. They show where kelps are settling onto the ocean floor. So it shows that kelps are being lost from the coast. Not all of it wash up onto the coast. Some of it is lost offshore, and when they are lost offshore, they sink out of the euphotic zone into the deep ocean. And one of the things that we want to do next is to go and find evidence that they are actually where the models say they must be, to go and ground truth these things, because a huge amount of hype has been built over the years around kelp exports and blue carbon and nonsense like that, which I seriously don't believe in. So, and it would be good to go and collect some geological evidence to show that kelps are being exported, but they are actually being locked down, drawn down into the sediments where they remain over time and don't have an opportunity to be remineralized, to go back into the atmosphere and so on. Which brings me to one of the reasons why I despise aquaculture, because so many of those claims are built around blue carbon, which is just absolutely false when it comes to seaweed. And on the right-hand side there, that talks to some of the work that Ismail is doing, and that's linking ocean currents. Previously on the left-hand set of slides, we linked ocean currents to kelp, but now we're linking ocean currents to where sea turtles are going. And Ismail has done some amazing generalized additive models to show that sea turtles significantly modulate their behavior and their foraging time, their foraging areas, based on various different features of ocean currents, which seems obvious, but now there's real evidence to show it. And it shows that places with a lot of chlorophyll A, a lot of phytoplankton production and so on, are places where sea turtles tend to go, and they also use the ocean currents themselves to speed themselves up. So they expend less energy to travel greater distances and so on. So the 9 panels you see on the right-hand side are 9 different turtles that were released by the Two Oceans Aquarium, and that show where some of them go to. You can see one of them even go up right past the Horn of Africa on the bottom right-hand side there. So that's another exciting study. And then the human dimension, this is where Akshata over there, her work has been on trying to understand how people's experiences and their values and so on are being modulated, changed, affected by their access to kelp resources, to how they think about kelp resources, various different aspects like that. I think this, for me, is definitely something that I would like to spend a little bit more time on. It's something that I have actively avoided in the past, but Akshata has shown that this is definitely something that not only our students are interested in doing this, but it is definitely quite challenging to do. If you come from someone who has only ever done biology and so on, and you try and go into that, I really take my hat off at people who are able to do this well. Patrick is here, and this is what he does really well. And I think this is definitely something which is valuable to do going forward, and to try and apply similar kinds of techniques to survey people, to gauge their experiences, their understanding, their effects on their livelihoods and so on, as they continually encounter an ever greater increasing change in the environment, which over generations they have been able to make a living on. So that's definitely one of the things that we want to do going forward. And then this is just quickly a slide to talk about what we're doing in the future. This is also something I talked about with Thomas long ago. The figure that you see, that the background image there is, it's a thing that we started to talk about in 2016 or so when Thomas was here. There you can see us installing a temperature recorder on a kelp stipe. And that instrument measures temperatures every 30 seconds or so, and it showed there that in the inshore region where kelps are, the temperature can rapidly change over 20 minutes from 15 degrees Celsius to about 11 or 10 degrees Celsius. That's how quickly upwelling happens. So we have developed this whole idea of, that's a couple of discrete, so separate units that we mount onto a kelp there. That was back in 2016. And recently we secured some funding to develop that thing on the right-hand side, which is called the RoboKelp, which is a string that we can attach to a kelp stipe. It has temperature recorders at levels up and down, and it has accelerometers, magnetometers, and so on, so you can simultaneously measure the change in the temperature up and down the stipe of the instrument. You can measure the rate of water movement, so that the amount of back and forth movement, the up and down movement that's due to waves and swells and so on. And it's got a GPS locating unit at the top there. In the head unit, it's able to transmit twice a day during low tide. All of the data gets transmitted via satellite back to your mobile device and so on. And we can have almost a semi-real-time, a near real-time insight into upwelling process, into the waviness and so on. So my dream, and it's probably something that I will get right over the next 5 or so years, is to install these instruments in kelp forests all the way along our coast to have a real-time network of kelp devices, kelp measuring devices. Because they will be manufactured en masse, they'll be cheap enough to, when they get dislodged and lost, we can easily replace them. So a unit like that would cost about 4,000 Rand to manufacture, so it's not too expensive, and this is done locally here in Cape Town. And they also have a GPS, so when the kelp breaks off and it floats around via ocean currents all the time, it will transmit where the kelp is going, and that's going to give us some additional information to go and ground truth Ross's kelp experiments, his numerical models, and so on. So that's another exciting project that we're looking at. I've already spoken a bit about blue carbon. That's what I want to do in the future. And also to try and quantify the other values that people, NCPs, nature's contribution to peoples, that people derive from the presence of kelp forests around us. And maybe to go back full circle to where I started, and which is when I spent a huge amount of time in nutrient analysis laboratories. I would really like to study the nutrient ecophysiology of kelp again, but I don't know how that's going to happen. That's going to require building a nutrient laboratory, and at the moment it's a dream and it's not something that I'm actively working on, but it's sticking around in the back of my mind. So that would be nice. That would really be nice. And then the other thing that I've been spending a huge amount of time on, especially in the last 2 years, in fact, since November 2022, I've been thinking a lot about AI and the consequences for teaching. Lots of things going through my head. It's influenced my website. It's had some consequences for how I teach, for tutoring, for assessments, and so on. So, I could have had another lecture if I decided to not speak about research. I could have spoken about AI and teaching and so on, because I have thought a lot about this. And honestly, I find it a little bit distracting because I have less time to think about the other stuff above that I'd rather be thinking about. But, I think any of us who don't spend a huge amount of time on AI at the moment, we are going to be surpassed by the students that we teach. And we don't want to find ourselves in such a situation. I think we need to find ourselves in a situation where we can expect more of our students and not less, and make more difficult topics accessible for them to do research on, and use it to enhance our productivity and free people up to look at the world, ask questions, be curious, and to do what people do, which is to develop a relationship with knowledge. So that's where I think we should be going in the future. And all of that needs to be done in a way that would support curiosity-driven questions of the kind that I asked up above. And that's it. So these are all the various things that I need to say thank you to. Those are all the places that supported me in funding and collaborations. It's some of them, it's not all of them, and so on. And then these are just photographs of some of the students and so on. Thank you to all of you. I would not have been there or here unless it had been for you. So it's amazing. There's many of them are there, and the ones that I've taught many years ago at UKZN, I recently went to Kenya, and then all over the place. So it's gratifying to see that I have had a small amount of impact, and I've affected people's lives, hopefully in a positive way, here and there. It's impossible to reach everyone, but I can reach some of them, and those people that I can work with well, they all seem to be smiling in all the pictures, so it can't be so terrible. And then these are some of the colleagues that I have had over the years. At the bottom left is David Skuman. Top left is Thomas Wernberg and Karen Fulby-Dexter. Both of them are kelp ecologists. On the top right is Lynn Shannon and Neville Swade. And then there's Tommy Bornman and Henry Housekeeper and all kinds of people like that who have inspired me to do interesting things, who's caused me to ask questions about things which probably I wouldn't have thought about if it hadn't been for conversations with them. So always be in a room with people that are brighter than you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
You did mention some stage, no, not so easily. You did mention some stage that you do some simulations and you don't know what the mathematics that is applied there and what's happening. So I just want to mention one word here. With with regards to AD simulations, you talk about AD currents. So some mathematician, applied mathematician, they work on AD current simulations. They use Maxwell's equations, time-dependent PDEs. They use finite elements to solve them. It's complicated. It's a big PhD project, and sometimes 2-3 PhDs need to do that together. So it's very complicated. So yes, it is possible. But now, one of your senior colleagues once mentioned that, you know, mathematicians are highly antisocial creatures. Mathematicians are highly antisocial creatures, you know. So, yeah, so, yeah, so I'm just thinking that, look, we are not the right person to take questions for you. So may I invite that person who made the comment, Professor Mark Gibbons, and take some questions.
Professor Smit, congratulations, congratulations. So all I can really say is, phew, phew. From A to B to C to D to E to F, do you ever stop? Do you ever stop? I mean, your mind is buzzing from one thing to the next.
That's exciting. I'm fortunate to have a career in a university where I'm able to do that kind of thing.
Yes, and thank you for being here. It was a very impressive talk, AJ, a very impressive talk, covering everything from ecophysiology through to people. Thank you. Before I open the floor to questions, I just have, I'm a pelagic ecologist, and there are two things. Why don't you collaborate more with oceanographers?
Why don't I?
Yeah.
I do. I mean, I work with people like Charia Patriarchi in Western Australia and Mike Roberts, who's a challenging person to work with, you know. And Jenny Veach at Sion, Isabel as well, I've collaborated with. Yeah, so
But are they doing your beck and call?
they are co-investigators on my most recent research project, ECHO. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So the other question I wanted to ask you was about the regime shifts that you're noticing in the off Caberca. Are you using zooplankton data that DFFE have collected in that area? Because, I mean, they've done routine surveys for many years that will cover that. I mean, the regime shift is going to trickle up from the physics through the phytoplankton to the zooplankton and the fisheries data? The fisheries
yes.
dependent data?
Yes, so that's again, it's part of this current, so Marek Ostrovsky just arrived here today and that's what we're working on now. Yeah.
So you got the data from DFFE?
So we will get the data from
Okay,
DFE, yes.
okay. Because that's fascinating.
Yeah.
And any idea what might have caused it? Because, I mean, these regime
Yes.
shifts in enzos and those
So-
sorts of things.
So I spoke with Mike Roberts about 2 weeks ago, and he seems to suggest that it's been a shift in the southern annular mode. So that
Okay.
high pressure, the wind belt, the westerly wind belt, had shifted a little bit further south, and that's caused the intensification of the high pressure system across the coast of South Africa, which has resulted in enhanced wind that's driving coastal upwelling. And the speeding up of the Agulhas Current is causing the friction between the shelf edge and so that's bringing the cold bottom water onto the shelf, but the wind and driven upwelling is bringing that to the water surface.
And any thoughts about whether it is likely to be a persistent feature or whether it's going to slip back into some other mode?
My feeling is it's going to revert back to the other state. Yeah.
Okay. Colleagues, are there any questions from the floor for Professor Smit?
See, this is what I typically have of all the students. They're usually just quiet. They look like glasses of milk just sitting there. Talk to me.
Yes, Gavin.
Gavin, he doesn't count. So, yeah, it's a good question because it is very sudden, And there is also a very sudden appearance of some mortality-related events subsequent to that period. So it does seem to be real in terms of observations in the physical ocean and consequences, at least in terms of mortality events. I don't yet know about ecological events or reconfigurations and so on. But other data that I have also analyzed, because you have to be careful when you look at sea surface temperature, especially remotely sensed data, is you have to verify that the patterns that you see in one data set also appear in a different data set. And the patterns are in a different data set. They are there as well, but they are more gradual. So that stark difference between 2007 and post 2007 is not so evident, but there's definitely, on average, a higher temperature there. It's not sudden in that sense. So it's a little bit ambiguous at the moment, but a change has happened. What's up for discussion is whether it happened rapidly or over an extended period of time.
Colleagues? Patrick.
Thank you very much. That was great. I just wanted to pick up on one point that you made, which you demonstrated in Angola, where their fishing industry is starting to shut down or is impacted by the weakening of the Benguela Current. This seems to have happened quite quickly over the last 20 years too. Can you track changes as far as moving southwards? Would you invest in the fishing industry?
Yeah, I would not invest in the fishing industry. No. Yeah, look, how long do we have in South Africa? No, I don't think it's going to happen here. It's a very different climate dynamic that happens up there. That's, the Angolan system is being affected at the same time also by the Angolan current, which is a very different system, and it's very different physical dynamics happening there. And the collapse there seems to have happened in the middle of, maybe about 10 years, 12 years ago or so. It's very well documented, actually, and the entire fisheries has entirely collapsed. There's a huge pool of very hot water sitting by the coast. People no longer have access to any of the fish that they traditionally used to, and so the livelihoods have changed. People are moving more away from fishing, or they have had to move away from fishing into more, into more agricultural types of subsistence farming types of activities to support themselves. Yeah. There's plenty of evidence to show that it has happened, yeah. Both in terms of the climate as well as the responses, fisheries as well as ecosystems. Yeah.
Colleagues? AJ, thank you very much.
Sorted. Thank you. Thank you.
May I call upon DVC Prof. Muteta Madiba to hand over the gifts. First, the big one to the speaker. Thank you, bro. Now, before I ask you all to go for a refreshment, there are just a couple of people who need to be acknowledged. So, first of all, we would like to thank the speaker, Prof. Smit, and then our rector and vice chancellor in his absentia, Prof. Balfour, DVC Prof. Matete, and other two DVCs in their absentia, and then the Dean of the Faculty of Natural Sciences, Prof. Holgate, HOD Prof. Rajkaran, the other deans from the other faculties, then the respondent Prof. Gibbons. We also want to thank it's Ms. Williams from IA, who sang the national anthem, and then the entire institutional advancement team for the banners, advertising, and creating the program. And then we wish to thank also Tasneem Parker from the faculty office, for all the faculty arrangements and coordination, and then the other members of the academic procession, and all the guests who made this event a success. Then I wish to acknowledge Prof. Given's mother. Sorry, Prof. You are looking at me, you're looking at me. Yes, you see now, we mathematicians make mistakes. Okay, my apology. So we would like to acknowledge Prof. Smit's mother, who was not able to make it to this event. And then I think you did mention some prominent colleagues who did make a lot of contribution to your research, who inspired and who assisted you also. And the fact that you picked few names here and there, their names are there, I would like to read their names so that they feel like, they were from a group of people who selected them, so they are more special than the others. So it's a Prof. Davis Kumar, and Prof. Sway, and Prof. Wenberg. And then just one thing here, I kept it at the end. So for all of us, we know that the person who always want somebody to be better than himself in his life is the father. Okay. Prof. Smit would like to acknowledge his father's contribution. He did mention about when he started reading, but he did a request, and we duly acknowledge his support for your entire career. Yes, so that's why I kept him at the end, so they can remember. And thanks to BCB once again. So before we go for refreshments, may I request that you all rise up for procession to leave the venue? Thank you, everyone. Okay. Please join for the refreshments.